after the report was issued, the progress in those years in terms of added installed capacity, in fact, exceeded this projection. So it seems like we're on the right course, and if 2011 is indeed a positive year, I think so far things are looking pretty good. And notice in about 2016, we start to see this bifurcation here. The green area represents or reflects the notion that offshore wind will start to contribute toward the goal of just over 305 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030, which would be 20% of the projected generating capacity in the U.S. by that time. And that reflects what you would imagine the contributions to be from the various states. Again, it's important to just point out, this is a scenario. It could have been a dozen or a couple dozen or many dozen different other scenarios that might have played out based on a different set of assumptions. But what it suggests is, with the exception of only a couple of states, most notably in the Southeast, all the states would be expected to contribute. If you can't read the legend from where you sit, the darker the shade of green, the greater the amount of installed capacity contributed by that state. So it suggests that most of the states would be engaged, and if you can't see the icons around the map of the U.S., all four of our coasts, West Coast, East Coast, Gulf, and Great Lakes, would be contributing through offshore installed wind capacity. And the takeaway here is we could expect to see in this scenario reduced coal consumption, reduced natural gas consumption for electricity generation, and the thought is, at least according to the economists, that that would reduce pressure on natural gas prices as well and bring those down. And I will go through this slide real quick. I'm not going to read it because I think everybody in the room is aware of all these benefits associated with the wind power that are driving the interest. I gave a talk similar to this yesterday to a group of freshmen who had not been exposed to this at all. And I pointed out one other very important bullet here, and that is, of course, these are students who were born in the 1990s, and I point out that it's only in their lifetimes that wind is indeed cost competitive with traditional power generation. And it's easy to assume, I guess, if you're that age, well, why not wind? And as you've heard from other speakers, because we have other traditional generating sources that are deeply entrenched in our psyche and our infrastructure and so on. But we have now an option that is highly reliable and cost competitive with other forms of new generation. Of course, environmental benefits, I don't have to tell you that. A little bit about the state perspective, and I don't want to harp too much on this either. You heard from Carol in great detail the PBR process and how that has played out. I will point out that one measure of progress we've seen in Virginia is that today a couple dozen, almost several dozen counties in Virginia, and also I should add that cities, are developing, have developed, or are considering development of an ordinance. Compared to about 5 years ago, I think about the time Rockingham County passed its small wind ordinance in 2004, John, I think I could have counted on half of one hand the number of other counties at that time that were developing ordinances or even knew what ordinance meant, wind ordinance, and what it would look like. Now we see a lot of activity being driven in part by developers, driven in part by state activities, grant rebate programs that were opened up last year. That is driving this process forward, and we are, again, doing what we can do to help in the process. Carol mentioned a stakeholder group that she has convened, trying to initiate or develop a model ordinance to provide even more support to the localities in developing these kinds of mechanisms. But the challenge is in Virginia, and if you haven't seen this particular wind map before, this is the older one. I'll show a new one in a bit. But what I like about this map, as opposed to the newer ones that are mostly green across the state, is that this really drives home how limited Virginia is geographically in terms of where commercial wind development can occur. We look at the old wind classes, defined up to 7. Well, we don't even have a 7 because we're in Virginia. I don't know if there's even a pocket of class 7 on land in Virginia, but the point is that it's these bright, bold colors representing the highest wind classes on land and over water in Virginia where commercial wind development can occur. And we're getting technologies now that are even allowing class 3 to come into the fold and be suitable in some locations for commercial wind development. But if you look at the map, most of Virginia on land is white or this sort of beige color. And those are not areas where commercial wind development is going to occur. So on land, we tend to look toward the western highlands and down into the southwest. Wherever you see these little beads of pearls of reds and blues and magentas is where the best wind resources are. Well, that's great. And I think you've heard someone mention already, we have a good wind resource across the state of Virginia. But the problem is, much of that wind resource is on public lands. This is from a study we did a number of years ago to really try to get our hands around where the winds were and where potential conflicts might reside. And what we found, as articulated in the sentence at the bottom here, 2/3 of our Class 3 and above wind energy resources are located in the waters off of our coast, in the Chesapeake and out into federal waters. And of the remaining 1/3, more than half of that resides on publicly used federal lands. It doesn't leave a lot of space on land. Yet there are good spaces, good locations, and the activities, the increasing number of activities among the development community bear that out. I've blown this map up just for a couple of regions, just to the west of Harrisonburg. Now you can start to see those pearls of brighter colors, but again, you notice the annotations here indicating that there is some private ownership of those lands, but a lot of that are on lands that, at least in this day and age, we don't expect development to occur in the near future. Likewise, in the vicinity of Lexington, you can see more areas that would appear at first glance to be potential wind development sites. But then again, you have other uses for those lands or ownership issues here, involvement of the federal government. And likewise, as we get down toward Roanoke. So some of you in the room know that there's been development of projects in these areas, but again, you're surrounded by areas that are sensitive, that are public lands, that have other uses, and certainly provide the potential for conflicts for wind development. So that's why siting is so important in Virginia in particular. Not to say that it isn't elsewhere, but we have a lot of uses, various uses on our lands, particularly in areas that are windy, and what we're finding now is that the same thing applies offshore as well. And there's the newer map, and I just have a few icons up here that give you a sense of who are some of the players in the development community. I know this is not a complete list, but it's some of the folks that we have interacted with who are either actively developing a project or are in the process of prospecting or identifying sites that would be suitable for development. And note Apex and Seawind, those are the two companies, Apex out of Charlottesville, Seawind out of Richmond, that responded very quickly last year when the former Minerals Management Service announced the final permitting rules for offshore wind projects. And they were the first one out the gate, first one to submit their applications for wind projects off the coast of Virginia. And the only two that I know of so far under those rules. This is just an image to reinforce that notion that the land-based winds really are focused on the western and southwestern part of Virginia. The offshore wind prospects have really improved dramatically in a few years, in a few very short years. I spent a year and a half, about from 2007 to 9, on a sabbatical, on a leave with the Department of Energy and the wind program. At that time, under the former administration and under former leadership, the words offshore wind were never put together in the wind program. There was no offshore wind program. The Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the time was not a supporter, at least a supporter of DOE supporting offshore wind. But a lot changed, and during that time was when the state started to step to the plate. Virginia clearly is one that has been aggressive and has been very supportive, but you go up and down the East Coast, and for that matter to some of the other parts of the country, and you see states picking up the ball and running with it. Funding efforts, funding studies, passing legislation, supporting programs or supporting initiatives that would encourage, if not in a stronger way, require investment in offshore wind. And the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Enforcement Regulation, BOEMR, formerly MMS, has been very closely engaged with Virginia and several of the other states on the East Coast that have